Stanley surname meaning and history presented by coadb.com. Surname meaning: it is an English habitational surname denoting a person who came from any of the places called Stanley, including those in Yorkshire, Staffordshire, Derbyshire, Durham, Gloucestershire, and Wiltshire, named from the Old English word stān, meaning stone or rock, and lēah, meaning woodland clearing. Hence, the name literally translates as stony meadow. Early bears: Robert de Stanley in Staffordshire in 1130, William de Stanley in Wiltshire in 1273, John in Oxfordshire in 1273, and John de Stanley and Robert Stanley in Yorkshire in 1379. Noble titles held included the Stanley Baronetcy of Bickerstaffe in the county of Lancaster. It was created in the Baronetage of England in 1627 for Sir Edward Stanley, who we see on the right. He was High Sheriff of Cheshire and Lancashire. The Stanley Baronetcy of Alderley Hall in the county of Cheshire was created in the Baronetage of England in 1660 for Sir Thomas Stanley, a barrister. And on the right we see Stanley Hall. The 7th Baronet of Alderley Hall, Sir John Thomas Stanley, was elevated to the peerage as Baron Stanley in 1839. John Thomas Stanley, 2nd Baron Stanley of Alderley, was elevated to the peerage was created Baron Edisbury in 1849. Stanley Baronetcy of Houghton in the county of Chester was created in the Baronetage of England in 1661 for Sir William Stanley. And on the right we see Houghton Hall. Stanley Baronetcy of Grange Gorman was created in the Baronetage of England in 1699 for Sir John Stanley, who became Chief Secretary of Ireland, and the title became extinct upon his death in 1744. Edward Stanley was an English soldier known for his deeds at the Battle of Flodden, who was summoned to the House of Lords as Baron Monteagle in 1514. Sir Thomas Stanley of Latham and Knowsley in Lancashire, a privy councillor and comptroller to the royal household, was created Baron Stanley in 1456. Thomas Stanley, the 2nd Baron Stanley, was created Earl of Derby in 1485. And the Earls of Derby were seated at Knowsley Hall, which we see here. They also owned Greenhall Castle, which we see the remains here from an old photograph. Here we see Thomas Stanley, the 2nd Earl, and Edward Stanley on the right, the 3rd Earl. Henry Stanley, 4th Earl of Derby. Fernando Stanley, the 5th Earl. Here we see William Stanley, the 6th Earl, and James Stanley, the 7th Earl. Charles Stanley, the 8th Earl, and William Stanley, the 9th Earl. James Stanley, 10th Earl of Derby, who died in 1736, and Edward Stanley, the 11th Earl of Derby, who died in 1776. Landed gentry included Stanley of Ponsby Hall and Cumberland, Stanley of Cross Hall and County Lancashire, England, Stanley of Palatine in County Hampshire, England, and Stanley of Longstow Hall in County Cambridge. Notables included Edward Stanley, an English clergyman who served as Bishop of Norwich, Captain Owen Stanley, born 1811, a British Royal Navy officer and surveyor. Charles John Stanley, born 1712, was an English composer and organist. Sir William Stanley, born 1435, was an English soldier and younger brother of the 1st Earl. Stanley fought with his troops in several battles during the War of the Roses. Venetia Anastasia Stanley, born 1600, was a celebrated beauty of the Stuart period and wife of the prominent scientist Sir Kenelm Digby. Early settlers included Roger Stanley, who came to Virginia in 1620, Morris, who came to Virginia in 1624, Thomas Stanley came to Massachusetts in 1634. John Stanley came to Connecticut in 1634. Joseph Stanley arrived in Georgia in 1732. Elizabeth came to Georgia in 1738. Sarah Stanley arrived in Maryland in 1749. David Stanley came to North Carolina in 1748. And lastly, Edward Stanley arrived in Nova Scotia, Canada in 1749. And if you enjoyed this video, please visit us at coadb.com, where we offer genealogy research. Link in the description. Thank you very much.